Hi, it's Nahani Rouse. Welcome back to Can We Talk, the podcast of the Jewish Women's Archive, where gender, history, and Jewish culture meet. Lenora LaMarche was born in 1921 in the Sephardic Jewish community in Seattle, Washington. She was born Lenora Piha and was better known as Leni. Leni grew up speaking Ladino. For over 30 years, she wrote a Ladino column in her synagogue newspaper. It was called Bavajadas de Ben Adam.
Bavajadas is a slang Ladino expression meaning a bunch of foolishness. So Bavajadas, a bunch of foolishness, D of Ben Adam. Ben is son of in Hebrew. Adam is Adam and Eve, which means human being. So it's Bavajadas de Ben Adam.
Or people's foolish little sayings. In the column, Leni chronicled the life of her community and created a lexicon of Ladino phrases. She recorded stories her mother had passed down from her childhood on the island of Rhodes, which is now part of Greece, but was then in the Ottoman Empire. Leni's ancestors had settled in Rhodes after fleeing the Spanish Inquisition. In the early 20th century, her parents and grandparents left Rhodes for Seattle. They joined a small but growing Sephardic community of Jews from Rhodes and Turkey. In 2001, Leni told her story as part of the Jewish Women's Archive Oral History Project, Weaving Women's Words.
Hi, this is Roz Bornstein, and it is May 4th, 2001, and I'm on Mercer Island, Washington, at the home of Leni LaMarche. Leni, do I have your permission to tape you today?
99.9%. 100% yes.
Thank you very much.
In this episode of Can We Talk, we'll hear excerpts of Leni LaMarche's interview. She reminisces about her Sephardic upbringing and talks about how she became a comedian and storyteller, peppering her stories with Ladino words and sayings. She also talks about her grandparents' modest beginnings. Her maternal grandfather was born in Rhodes in 1864, her grandmother in 1870.
Like most people, we don't ask questions until the person is deceased, and then you wonder, what are you going to do? Who's going to know the answer? But I do want to tell you how much I admire my grandmother. Her name was Luna. Luna in Spanish meaning moon. And my grandfather's name was Eliezer Ben Vinisti. Anyways, they had 9 children, and everybody was poor there, and everybody had that many children. It was nothing so rare. They lived in the old city, but they lived what they call the ghettos. No running water, so they had to go out in the pozo. The pozo means a well, and that's where they would get in line with your chanaka. And that's a Turkish word meaning a container. And the Sephardics lived in one area, Greeks lived in the other area, the Turks lived in another area, and so on.
Leni's grandmother worked in a factory packing dates and figs. Her grandfather was a peddler who sold pots and pans. Many of the Jews in Rhodes were leaving for better economic opportunities and to escape discrimination. Leni's oldest aunt and 2 of her uncles had already left for America. Her grandmother went to visit to help with her daughter's first baby. She ended up staying and working as a midwife for young Sephardic mothers. Eventually, she saved enough money to bring the rest of her family to America.
So she sent them the fare in this big envelope. And my Aunt Betty said because that envelope arrived before Shabbat ended, they got it on a Shabbat, my grandpa would not tear it open because it was against the Jewish law to tear anything. They had to wait until the 3 stars were up in the heaven, which meant Shabbat is over with. And my grandpa opened it up, and there was all these for them to come to the United States. They went wild. They're going to America. They're going to America. Got excited. Anyway, so they came to America with that money.
What year was this when the rest of the family came over?
My grandmother came here in 1914, and my mother came here in 1916. She must have been about 18, 19 years old then. They came to Seattle, and what's my grandfather going to do, you know? And when you're 55 years old, you're old. And he was old. He had a beard. But what could he do? So he taught Hebrew school.
In Seattle?
In Seattle.
For what community? For the Sephardic community?
Oh, yeah. Because they had nothing to do with the Ashkenazics, had nothing to do with the Sephardics. So they kind of shied away because they were used to living that way in the old country.
The Jews from Rhodes, who called themselves Rhodeslis, founded their own congregation, Ezra B'Sereth, in 1917. Around the same time, the Sephardim from Turkey started Bikur Cholim. Both are still Orthodox synagogues today. In the early 20th century, the Sephardic communities were tight-knit. Life cycle celebrations were traditional communal affairs. Leni's parents met at a family wedding in the 19-teens.
Then when my mother got engaged, it would be a big ritual. We called it the mandada. So the mandada for engagement. You call all your friends over and you have a big, like a fiesta, you know. We called that visita. People always had visitas to go to then, not now. And then for the marriage, they have baño de novia. They go to the mikvah. And that's where they go to the bath. Then when the woman would come in with her hair all wet and her fingers all clipped, her cheeks were rosy, and she walks in with this grin. Very embarrassed, knowing that some of the ladies saw her in the nude, in the baño. And then she would come in and everybody would be applauding because they would sing this song. Con bien mi lavi, con bien mi shauni, la la da 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 da. Anyways, they would sing this, and then everybody, ya viene la novia. It was kind of fun to see that. And of course, I used to wonder, these old women, you know, when they talk about dirty old men, these are dirty old ladies. Because they think, oh boy, you're going to have some fun tonight now, honey.
What do you remember about your early childhood in Seattle?
Well, I have a very vivid memory. My grandfather was a very holy, godly man. He used to, when I'd step on an ant, I remember him telling me when I was a little girl, no mates las hormigas, because ellos también tienen alma. And that meant do not step on those ants, because those ants have a soul. And then I remember my dad working the Rhodes department store. He had a little stanja. Stanja Ladino is a little shop. And there he shined shoes, and if somebody wanted shoelaces or maybe polish, he would sell it to them. That's it. I mean, he wasn't the best businessman, but he made a pretty good living there, even during the Depression. And every Friday night, my mother would be in her glory. Oh, the cooked meals were all cooked and all that, and she would tell us stories about Johah. Stupid Johah.
Do you remember any really short or quick stories that you can tell us here about one that your mother would tell you that you really enjoyed?
Había de ser un hombre que se llamaba Johah. Now, ese Johah estaba esposado que se va a casar.
Once upon a time, there was a young man named Juha who was engaged to Belisa. On Rosh Hashanah, Belisa's mother invited Juha to their home for a delicious dinner, which he greatly enjoyed. But when it was time to go home, he was greeted by thunder and lightning and torrential rain. His future mother-in-law suggested he stay the night, saying, "You couldn't possibly go home in this downpour. You'll be drenched." The two women went upstairs to make his bed. When they came back, he was nowhere to be found. Belisa cried, "Oh, Dio," thinking her fiancé had left her. Then there was a knock at the door. It was Johá, soaking wet.
Johá mojado por inteiro. Adioíjo bueno, onde estavas?
Johá, what happened? Where did you go?
Me fui a casa para tomar o chumis.
Johá said, I went home to get my pajamas.
So they're all like that.
And this was your mother would teach these stories to
Oh,
you.
she would tell us.
She would tell you
Friday nights. And, I remembered everything.
Was this for entertainment for the family, or was it to teach them a moral?
To laugh. You had to have somebody to echar shon and to tell stories.
Leni inherited her mother's gift for entertaining people. Her mother encouraged it, dressing her like a rabbi and getting her to do imitations.
There was one man, I won't mention his name. One man, when I was a kid here, I used to watch him. I was about 8, 9 years old. He'd be, what they call, the Ashkenazi call davening, to daven. We don't do that much. They go back and forth, back and forth. And so my mother would say, come on, get up there and show us how Mr. So-and-so. And I'd go, and they thought that was so funny. And I would go, well, if they think it's funny, I would do it, Anyway, so that's how I got into making people laugh.
Where did you perform this skit?
Right in the living room.
Okay.
That's how movie stars came to be. I don't know what happened to me.
What did you do after high school?
I worked in a factory with bed springs because I had no confidence in myself. And the only time I got any accolades, any laughter, was when I used to entertain.
In her early 20s, Leni married a man from the Sephardic community. They had a daughter, but divorced when the baby was 1. Leni had to board her daughter with other families while she worked. Then finally, they moved in with a friend. Soon, Leni met Duke LaMarche. They dated for a year and then decided they wanted to get married, even though Duke wasn't Jewish.
In those days, marry a non-Jew, God forbid. And then when it came to tell my mother, and I can still see her, she was in the bathroom putting on her hat. And she says, adios, ¿cuántos hablando? And she got into that, in Spanish. Adios, cuál me mando? Oh, boy. And so I went home and, of course, cried that day, cried the next day, cried the day after that. And I could understand, that her daughter, that in that year should marry a non-Jew, God forbid.
It was 1945, the year that World War II ended, and the scale of the destruction of European Jews was coming to light.
One day, all of a sudden, I thought of it. I lay there in bed, and I thought, wait a minute. I like I was born again. Why can't I get married? Why can't I have a Jewish home? And I suddenly thought, I'm going to marry him. So I called him up, and I told him that it's not going to be a 50-50 proposition in our marriage, because I'm too Jewish. My kids are going to be Jewish, and that's the only way I'll take him. And he says, I have no religion at all. I never went to Sunday school. And he was quite the reader. And I learned a lot about the Ladinos from him, Sephardics and whatnot. So, that was just the music to my ears, We're going to get married. Oh, alegría grande. He was so happy. And so we got married.
Leni's mother grew to love Duke, but never fully accepted their marriage. Leni and Duke lived in the middle of the Sephardic neighborhood and were both very involved in the Jewish community. Duke even wore a talit when they went to synagogue, though he never converted. They had 3 boys plus her daughter from her first marriage. When her children got older, Leni volunteered at a Jewish retirement home where her grandmother lived.
When I started there 27 years ago, the main reason I went there is because when I went to visit and I looked around, and I saw where the Sephardics are continuing their characters of being by themselves because their English wasn't good. But amongst each other, they can talk,
Leni led a Ladino program for the Sephardic women. She'd read to them, do comedy, and tell Johá stories. Sometimes she had to use her charm to coax them to come.
The ladies then were, oh, I don't feel good. No estoy pudiendo. Adiós. No estoy pudiendo. No, come on. I don't want to mention names. Come here and I'll get your shoes on. No, hija. Oh, please, come on. Por tu cara que voy a ir. For me, that they're going to do that. I went, all right. I go around, find their shoes, put it on, get a wheelchair, get them in. Anyway, little by little, I got to know the ladies there, the residents. And then it annoyed me when I saw one Ashkenazic lady mimicking one of the ladies that spoke Ladino. And I didn't know what to do. And I says, I'm not going to scold her. And I got to tell them about what is Sephardic? What is it? And I explained to them the story. And they said, well, I didn't know that. Those Ashkenazic did not know there was such a thing as a Sephardic Jew. So anyway, and I explained that story, and she says, well, and I feel bad saying anything negative about this lady, because she apologized, says, well, I didn't know they went through all that. Somebody should have told us. And so after that, they were a little kinder to our ladies.
Leni started as a volunteer and ended up working at the senior center. She also polished her comedy act and became a stand-up comedian. Here, she describes performing at a Sephardic convention in Los Angeles. The audience loved her. She reminded them of their grandparents.
All I had to do was get on the front where the stage is supposedly supposed to be. And I just walked out and everybody started roared laughing. So, they knew me. And I didn't have to say much to make them to laugh. Before I even end up, they started this laughing. Like when I started, I go, hombres y mujeres. And everybody would laugh and laugh. Adiós, ¿de qué estás riendo? Quando vou falar, não é coisa de rir. Ai, por dolor. Mira, agora não é respeito del todo.
What are you laughing at? So disrespectful.
So this is what it is. And you can laugh because you get an idea of what your grandma was talking about. But our Sephardic young people, they don't speak it much. They understand it, but they don't speak it. And they got a big bang of the way I was imitating these old ladies. And complaining about their daughter-in-law, complaining about their kids, complaining about the synagogue. And I was using terminologies that only was used by our mothers. Well, I could hear people saying that, oh, my mother was like that. Oh, my grandmother was just like you. You just sound just like my aunt.
Leni's aunts, her grandmother, and mother passed on a rich lexicon of Ladino words and stories. Leni collected them in her column, Bavajadas de Ben Adam. She'd use some of the phrases in her stand-up routine.
Achukati, sit your ass down. And everybody laughs when they heard that. They haven't heard this since they were children. Achukati. Aringa. And then I would say aringa. And I'd go, aringa, ringa, Rosie. Okay. Then, caída, literally falling star, bad luck person. Caída que te vega. The people from Turkey used to say this a lot. Bad luck. But it was said in jest. But if you were really angry and then you would say that, caída te vega, and then boy, it would be a big fight. And so all these words.
Leni's Ladino words and stories hold the cultural memory of her family and community. Leni LaMarche died in 2012 at age 90 in the same retirement home where she worked. She had 4 children, 8 grandchildren, and 11 great-grandchildren. In her obituary, she was remembered for her unconditional love, contagious smile, quick humor, and well-earned authority on everything Sephardic. In her interview, Leni remarked that few young Sephardic people spoke Ladino. Today, Ladino is seeing a resurgence, as Jews, many of them in their 20s, are taking an interest in the language. In our next episode, we'll hear from Ladino speakers and experts about their efforts to breathe new life into the language through Ladino clubs, Zoom lessons, and online forums. Thank you for joining us for Can We Talk, the podcast of the Jewish Women's Archive. Our team includes Jen Richler and Judith Rosenbaum. Our theme music is by Girls in Trouble. Find us online at jwa.org/canwetalk or on your favorite podcast app. I'm Nahani Rouse. Until next time.